Welcome to the Samson Strength Coach Collective. I'm Connor Agnew, obviously your host. Good to connect with you again. First of all, 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go out to Fort Worth, Texas for CSCCA conference. I saw a lot of you there. If you're listening, hopefully you're listening. If I saw you there, but I just want to say this, and Samson has not asked me at all to say this, but I think it's really important to get out. That is the coolest group of people I've met in my life. I mean, seriously, they were awesome. I get to spend 2 days with them, 3 in the morning, 2 days in the morning, and just to work with them. I've always respected Samson, what they've done, and obviously, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be the podcast host. But one, to see the quality of the weight rooms that they build, and the quality of the equipment that they have was astounding. Two, to understand the process of working with the people at Samson, and the quality of people that they have. And then three, watching them interact with other coaches and watching the quality that they can provide to coaches across the country. I mean, it was astounding to me. So, again, Samson did not ask me to say this. This is, they might even edit this out and ask me not to put it in. But I urge you, if you are looking for any type of weight room solution, we'll put it like that. I urge you to reach out to Samson because, man, seriously, they were fantastic. And it made me really, really proud to be the host of a podcast run by them, and then also to be affiliated with this group of people because they were awesome. I mean, like the whole thing is you call them and the owner's going to pick up, right? I think that is just so cool. So that's kind of my final spiel for Samson. But again, I appreciate the opportunity to be the host. But for today's episode specifically, we have Miranda Smith, assistant director of sports nutrition at University of North Texas. Miranda and I have been friends adjacent via my fiance for 4 years now, 5 years now almost. And so Miranda does a fantastic job at University of North Texas. I've heard fantastic things from my fiance the whole time that they've been friends. And so it was really cool for me to, one, meet her on the podcast and talk with her, but then two, understand her process. And the things that we talked about were really valuable. What's the difference between a dietitian and a nutritionist? There's a big difference. Okay. So make sure you listen in on that. How do you approach conversations with your athletes? How do you approach conversations with your head coaches? So I think it's really important for strength coaches to understand the perspective of other health professionals in the field. And so we want to follow that theme, and we want to invite those people on this podcast so that our strength coach listeners and anybody who does listen to this podcast can look at things from multiple angles and understand where other health professionals are coming from as well. So as always, I hope you enjoy, and thank you for listening. Hello, Samson Strength Coach Collective listeners. On today's episode, we have Miranda Smith coming on. Miranda, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. This is funny. This is the first time Miranda and I have ever spoken face to face, but I've heard Miranda's name a million times. She's a good friend of my fiance. They met at school at UAB, so I'm excited to actually get to talk to you for once instead of you FaceTiming her.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Miranda is the assistant director of sports nutrition at University of North Texas, same location where Jason Martinez, a previous guest, is currently working as well. Can you kind of just give us a brief background of your career and then what's brought you to UNT?
Yeah, absolutely. So to start off my career, I actually started as an outpatient dietitian in a hospital. So I got to do just nutrition counseling all day long. And it was based in Fort Worth. And I loved getting to just have that one-on-one interaction with patients and really help them establish those healthy habits, but knew I wanted to work with a more motivated, more active population, and found the job with UNT. It was starting as a fellow position. So a lot of nutrition fellow positions are a way to get your foot in the door in sports nutrition at a lot of colleges. This position was unique because it required you to be a dietitian, which I was. And so I got to actually handle my own teams. So I was actually part-time at UNT and part-time at the hospital still when I first started 2 years ago. And so I was working with the track and cross country team and just softball team at the time with UNT while finishing up the hospital. And then the spring of last year, I took on helping with football to get experience in that realm. And then during the summer, I took on the women's basketball team because they didn't have a full-time dietitian. And so now my sports are the women's basketball team, softball, and track and field and cross country team. And as of like March this past year, or March of this year, it finally went full time. And so went from a fellow position to now assistant director of sports nutrition, which has been really cool because I really love the school, love the people I work with, the athletes I work with. It's been a really great opportunity to grow as a dietitian, but also see the ins and outs of sports nutrition and the athletic world.
Well, first of all, congratulations on the full-time position.
Thank you.
Very exciting, right? That's always super fun when you can
Yes.
kind of move up, yep, and get
Yep.
the benefits are also really cool too. So
Absolutely.
it makes a difference. So you started out an outpatient. What are the main differences that you see as a dietitian in outpatient versus an athletic population?
With the outpatient, a lot of the patients came in just because their doctor told them to. Some of them were interested in actually making their nutrition changes. They wanted to lose weight or help with their disease state, whether it was newly diagnosed type 2 diabetes or heart disease, kidney disease. The athletic population, they're a lot more motivated to fuel for their sport, or at least understand like why they need the energy they need. Um, and so it was kind of, there's still similar instances of they both need to eat more in general, surprisingly. Because a lot of them undereat in the first place, even in the hospital setting. A lot of them were undereating because they were just told by their doctor to cut out so many food groups to handle their diabetes. And that wasn't the case. It was just finding that balance in their diet. And so, but that was kind of the biggest difference is it could be super non-motivated patients or patients that were just kind of trying to check a box. And then others were trying to actually sustain those habits throughout their life.
Has that outpatient experience influenced your athletic population kind of coaching or counseling? Because I can think of people who have worked in collegiate, working with now professional sports on the strength and conditioning side. It's certainly a different environment, but they kind of take things from those specific areas and apply it to where they currently are. Has that influenced how you consult?
Absolutely. It really helped me grow in that area of my field and just helping my like athletes in general, just being able to talk to them. I think the biggest challenge while I was still working with the hospital and in the college, it was kind of two opposite spectrums. So a lot of people in the hospital are wanting to lose weight, eat the minimal things in general. And then my athletes, they need twice as many calories typically as an average person. So it was kind of like the opposite side of education for them, but still the similar principles of getting enough protein and getting enough carbohydrates, getting enough like color in their diet from fruits and vegetables. But it really just kind of helped me with that people aspect of getting to know my athletes. I love getting to know my patients too, just even outside of their nutrition goals, because it just really helps build that trust. And so I really think that helped me prepare for my job in college athletics too, because those athletes, it takes a lot of time to build that trust with them. And so they're not going to want to just be told what they should eat or what they shouldn't eat. And so it's really just getting to know them on a personal level, getting to know their background with nutrition, understanding that they all grew up differently. Some of them maybe grew up in a household where their parents cooked all the time, so they didn't have to worry about it. And maybe they learned those cooking principles. And then other times their parents like had busy schedules, so they just kind of ate whatever was around the house. And so it's just kind of navigating those different backgrounds, those different challenges that each athlete has.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, and I feel like it's kind of dawning on me now, right? It's going to be harder to develop trust with athletes than it may be for somebody like a strength coach because, there's always misconceptions that everybody has to deal with in their professions, right? And so there's
Yep.
certain things where, athletes will come in and see someone on Instagram and be like, oh, we should do this, right? And it's like, well, I would never put that in my program in a million years, right?
Yeah.
But, it's a smaller part of the overall human population that actually exercises. So those misconceptions are a little less common, whereas every single person eats, and everybody deals with food on a daily basis. So do you feel like that contributes to having a little bit longer of a time to develop trust with the people you work with?
Oh, absolutely. And just the biggest challenge in my field in general is getting rid of all the misinformation out there. That's always going to be there. So trying to um, just kind of decipher that for them so they're not confused all the time from social media aspects is a huge challenge.
And, it's so interesting because you see almost on a daily basis handouts, right? Or small information kind of nuggets that the athletes can actually interpret and then will help them understand what you're trying to communicate a little bit better, right? I typically don't give handouts to our athletes because it's a little bit of an easier conversation because it's not as prevalent within the athlete's life versus for y'all. It's like it's every single possible way you can receive that information, you're getting it. And so you're going to have to counteract that misinformation.
Yeah. Yeah. Even some of my athletes, they're like, so I saw this thing on TikTok. I'm like, oh boy, here we go.
Yeah, it was probably one of my terrible videos on TikTok, so I'm glad they are avoiding those. And so it sounds like from the breakdown of your department, you guys have multiple dietitians on staff. Is that correct?
Yes, we have 3 full-time dietitians now. So because I'm now full-time, I actually took the 2 intern spots that we had, um, so we can have more stability throughout our sports. And so our one of our other dietitians is actually the wife of Jason, and she works with men's basketball, and swim and dive, tennis, and our volleyball team. And then our boss works with football, soccer, and then men's and women's golf. So we all kind of have our individual sports. We'll still help out with each other when needed. So it's not like oh, that's your sport, you can only work with that sport. We really help each other. If one of us needs to be gone for any reason, or if there's an athlete that maybe might work better with one of us versus who they have, that's perfectly fine.
Mm. One of the things that I'm curious about is just I think schools are starting to understand the importance of having a dietitian on staff.
Yeah.
They understand that there's value in it, when there 1,000% is. What's the value in having multiple dietitians versus just one?
Well, when we have like 400 athletes, it's a lot easier to split them up that way versus having one dietitian over all the athletes. And so we can really spend a lot more one-on-one time with them. Like even with like the track team and women's basketball and softball, like I still have like 150 or so athletes just on my own. Um, and so it really helps us kind of work with those specific coaches and athletic trainers and everyone involved to really get an individualized approach to the athletes that really need it. Some of them are pretty self-sufficient and can take care of things themselves and will just come to you when they want to. And then others really need that additional support from everyone involved.
No, I mean, it just makes complete sense to me when we talk about a sports performance team, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the ability to actually have consistent meetings because, obviously with Tess, we can see that she's really just trying to reach everybody and have quick
Yeah.
consults. And so it would be, unfair of us to say, hey, why don't you come in for a meeting on a weekly basis, right?
Yeah.
Because now that's an hour we've taken away from when she could be meeting with other athletes.
Yeah.
And so especially from that trust development standpoint as well too, you have more times to individualize what you're doing, but then also develop that trust with the athlete. How can dietitians kind of advocate, or strength coaches or the sport performance team as a whole, how can they advocate to administration for a little bit more of a dietitians on staff, right? To have more people to actually help out. What would be the best way in your opinion to kind of communicate that to our administrators?
It's really just kind of education. We kind of had to do that this last year. Like when I started working, my boss really worked hard to kind of get that third full-time position because it was so necessary to help more of those athletes, and seeing the things that we can implement as dietitians with team educations, with just helping support the athletes if they're recovering from an injury. It's really just kind of educating everyone involved on how we can help each other.
No, I had to go through the same process, right? So we had 2 full-time strength coaches on the Olympic side here at App.
Yeah.
And, when I first got here, I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe that that was the process. Like, I just it's exactly what you mentioned. Like, we have, I think it's over 300 athletes, not including football. And so we're supposed to divide those up and then have specific teams have GAs who are, people who are still trying to learn. We're all trying to learn consistently, but
Yes.
there's a certain level of experience that comes with full-time coaches. And so it was dumb. I mean, I was dumbfounded just to see how hard it was to actually convince our administrators that we actually need another full-time strength coach. And it took us going through, and I had to email every other strength coach in the Sun Belt just to say, how many full-time Olympic strength coaches do you have on staff? put them all together and show that we were dead last in ratios of teams to Olympic strength coaches, and then actually show our administration that piece. So again, the education, I think, was the biggest thing for us to explain to them that this is necessary. We can decrease injury rates. We can probably save money on medical
Yep.
bills. We can have more trust within the strength and conditioning department. It's just a positive thing overall versus something, like something in your area. Zone In is a great tool, right? But it doesn't actually influence. It doesn't influence just as much as an actual person would in
Yep.
those conversations. So that was a frustration I certainly faced, was trying not to buy like this new cool technology, and instead let's invest in another human being who can be really beneficial to us.
Yeah. It was also just like showing like how many hours that we worked with just having a few of us. Like when you're working 50 plus hours a week, we're like, okay, where can we best utilize those hours and kind of minimize that so we still have a work-life balance too, which is very hard to find in athletics.
Mm.
Um, but kind of showing that piece and like where that can be like allocated and stuff. And so, and just produce less turnover too by having a third full time within the sports, but also um, just like our department in general. Like in my fellow position before, there had been, I think, 3 people before me. And it was usually just after 1 year that they would go. And so, like women's basketball had never had a full time dietitian with them. So they were just kind of used to doing things on their own. And that may not have been the most efficient way. And so I really worked hard like all year to get that implemented, build that trust with them. We had a brand new coaching staff. So it was like, okay, we can all kind of figure out what works, what doesn't work this year. And we ended up winning our conference championship. And so we did something right.
Those things are certainly connected,
Yeah.
and the turnover piece is actually really interesting too, because again, if you are overworked, you're going to be more likely to look for a new position.
Mhm.
I also remember asking for a GA too. I asked for a
Yeah.
lot this past year, so they're kind of annoyed with me. But I took a screenshot of my schedule in season, and I
Yeah.
showed them. I was like, not only is it 80 hours per week, but also things are literally overlapping, and I can't be at 2 places at once. And so
Exactly.
it was interesting to see. It kind of opened my eyes, and I'm sure you felt the same thing. Of First of all, the administration really had no clue what we were doing.
Yep.
They kind of just thought it was for me playing patty cake in the weight room and then going home at 4 o'clock, when
Yeah.
that was absolutely not the case. So
No.
it was an interesting process, and I think the reason why I'm kind of harping on this topic is because dietitians and strength coaches face the same issue. I think
Yeah.
strength coaches honestly have a little bit easier because it's been a field that's been developed, and the importance has been kind of driven home to administration a little bit more. Whereas dietitians, it's now really trying to focus on developing the staff as a whole and getting more on staff. But ultimately, we both face the same issues, and we both work hand in hand together. So
Yeah.
the more positions we have of each, the more we can work with each other, and the better overall it'll be.
Yeah. Exactly.
Wow. Okay, so this is something I really wanted to get into today, and I think it's really important for our listeners to hear about. Obviously, I'm very well educated in the difference, but I think it'd be really good for everybody to understand what is the difference between a dietitian and a nutritionist.
This is my favorite question. I love to answer. So I'm going to tell you like one of my favorite professors in undergrad, he explained this difference. And I still remember it to this day, but a nutritionist, like there's no regulations technically, like your dog or cat could be a nutritionist. I've even seen someone on social media actually get like a nutrition certification under their dog's name. Um, and I was like, okay.
It's
Um,
insane.
yeah, it's crazy. And so anyone can be a nutritionist, their own nutrition expert. Um, Nutrition is not a one size fits all by any means. But with like the nutritionist, like some people can take like a 6 to 8 week, maybe even 12-week online course. But to be a dietitian, you have at least 5 years of education. So I had to go through a bachelor's program that had approved classes in order to get into a dietetic internship, what we consider a DPD program. And so, in order to get into that dietetic internship, you had to have the right grades, the right test scores, experience in different areas, and you go through a matching process, kind of like med school, to where you basically rank the schools that you're applying to in the order of where you would want to go. And then if that school ranks you in the same spot, that's where you go. We applied by like February and we found out in April. So there was like a 2-month waiting process and you didn't know if you were going to get accepted to a school or not. And so like if I went to UAB, and so if I ranked UAB first, they ranked me first, that's where I went. If UAB hadn't accepted me, I had ranked FSU second. And so if I didn't get accepted to UAB, I would have probably been accepted to FSU and gone there. And so it's kind of a long process like that. And they just kind of go through the list. It's all through a computer system. They actually just recently took that out after the spring season. So there's been some changes and throughout that process. So that's been interesting. And I think it's all been because of COVID and everything, because the year that I applied was the COVID year. But we didn't know until after the application process anyways. And then once you get into that dietetic internship, they're typically at least a year long, but most are a year and a half to 2 years long. So mine was a combined program with the master's and internship for 1 year. And so you have to have at least that 5 years of education, basically, to be a dietitian. And it was 1,200 hours of supervised practice. Back then, I wasn't required to have a master's to be a dietitian to sit for the national exam. But come 2024, as of this year, it was required. So I was like, may as well do it. And so did that. Once you go through your internship and master's, you basically get the approval from your director, get all the forms filled out, and you can sign up for the national exam, which is a computer exam. And for, I know a lot of dietitians, it made you question your entire career. It was probably the hardest exam I've ever taken, but worth it now. And then you have to have 75 hours of continuing education credits every 5 years to maintain that credential, and also get licensure in the state that you're in. Not every single state requires licensure to practice as a dietitian, but Texas does. So I got the Texas license since I was here. But you can also get different license in different states if you're taking online clients elsewhere, if that state requires that license.
So it sounds like the glaring difference is time and education
Yes.
behind the two. Okay.
Yeah.
And so how can somebody identify, just based simply, if somebody were to look at an Instagram or on a LinkedIn profile, how can somebody identify the difference between a nutritionist and a registered dietitian?
Usually it's just going to be those letters after their name. If they have like RD, LD for a sports dietitian, CSSD is an extra certification you can have. That's going to be kind of the biggest difference. Or they'll have like registered dietitian in their like bio. You can use the term registered dietitian nutritionist, so an RDN. But I didn't want to do that because I think it's confusing. And so I just use RD to keep it short and simple. And then most people that are nutritionists will just have nutritionist or like health coach or health expert or something in their title. And they may not have any background in nutrition from their undergrad career or master's program. Because you can still have like a bachelor's, master's in nutrition without being a dietitian, because some of them go into more of the research side of things or food science side of things. And so there's different ways that you can go and still not be a dietitian, but that doesn't mean you're a nutritionist either.
And so what would be the main differences in scope of practice for a dietitian versus a nutritionist?
Dietitian is the one that can legally and ethically provide like medical nutrition therapy to people to help manage different disease states, all the diabetes, heart disease, renal disease, helping even with cancer and everything too, along with eating disorders. So there's a lot of specialized dietitians that practice in eating disorders. And then same with like hormone balancing, PCOS, different hormonal issues like that. A lot of dietitians can get specialties in that, or GI issues. So people with gut health issues, they're going to be able to practice with that. Nutritionists say that they can provide meal plans for people. That's really not ethically the case, but unfortunately, there's not a whole lot we can do right now because there's no title for them to take. So like legally, I can provide a meal plan for people. In my experience, I don't prefer doing that because most people are not going to follow a meal plan to a T. And so that's kind of the biggest difference there.
It's so funny to me because every RD I've spoken to never does meal plans. And so that's almost an indicator itself, is if you're working with somebody, unless it's wrestling or weight class sport
Yeah.
or bodybuilding, I mean, which are those are people who are most likely to actually stick with the plan because they have to hit a specific body weight. But I mean, outside of that, like almost every RD I've spoken to does not do meal plans. Then almost every nutritionist I've spoken to, it's like the first thing that they do.
Because it's easier for them to just throw a number at someone and then help fill in the calories, but that doesn't help them create those sustainable habits from the people that I've worked with. I very rarely have made meal plans even for some of my athletes unless I know it's just going to help guide them based off what they currently eat. But we really just look at what they're eating first, because sometimes it's just getting them to eat more consistently throughout the day than the calories. Because if they're only eating once a day, well, I want to get them up to 2 or 3 times a day and then go from there. I'm not going to waste time building a meal plan that they're not going to follow, because realistically, it's not going to happen for them to eat 6 times a day when they're used to eating once.
Yeah, I almost compare it to having somebody come in and you're personal training them, right? And then the
Mm-hmm.
first thing that you're gonna do is take them through a triphasic program, which is one of the most advanced programs that you can possibly do. And they're gonna go on a undulating periodization and do all this funky stuff. And then it doesn't matter at the end of the day because they're not gonna really see the performance gains that they would by making small changes or
Yeah.
just teaching them how to squat, how to bench, how to
Yeah.
deadlift, the important few items that are going to give them the change so they can actually see that reflected in what they do on a daily basis. And that's why I love so much about dietetics and seeing Tess work with people and then other dietitians work with those athletes. Is they'll come in, they'll just be like, yeah, I ate breakfast and I feel so much better today. And it's like, oh
What
my
a concept.
God. Yeah, it's incredible, right?
Yeah.
You eat energy, you feel better. So
Yeah.
I'm curious about this as well too, and please give me an honest answer because I really want to know, and I think the listeners would benefit from hearing this as well too. How do you feel about someone such as myself getting a performance nutrition level one certification? Right, I think it's precision
Mm-hmm.
nutrition. Right, I think strength coaches do this a lot of times with good intent to try to understand their nutrition better and how to help their athletes. As a dietitian, how do you see people who kind of undergo that process?
I think it'd be beneficial for you to like just help with your education of it and understand like our job and like the foundation of knowledge that we have. But I don't think it's necessarily like needed if you have the people and resources to help you in that area. So that would be kind of like me getting a strength and conditioning certification. There's still some dietitians that can do that just to have that extra knowledge, which I think is perfectly fine, but not necessarily for your job. I think it's great to have that extra knowledge education. Like when I did my personal training, I more so realized it was great to have that knowledge for myself, but I wasn't the best at training clients in that way. It was more so just for my knowledge and background and just to help um, with myself personally. And so there's also so much more um, like credibility for strength coaches and things versus even personal trainers. And so just kind of learning that too.
To me, that situation kind of gets gray and it gets a little dangerous, because I've noticed this, right? I like to pretend that I'm smart and try to get that across to the athletes all the time. But let's say I read an article about something, right? So it was actually a really specific example when I was at Tennessee. Something like a constant tension squat, right? So you don't
Mm-hmm.
reach a full lockout, you just immediately go into the next rep. And so the next day, somebody wasn't locking out, and I was like, "Hey, man, you got to lock out all the way. What you're doing right now is a constant tension squat, right?"
Yeah.
And so it was something that was fresh on my mind, and I immediately used.
Yeah.
And so the reason I say it gets dangerous is because let's say I take this nutrition certification, it's going to be on the top of my mind. And so somebody's going to talk about eating at some point during the day. There's a
Yeah.
guarantee. So then I'm going to interject myself and then just try to show that I've learned about this process or I understand a little bit more about it. And then it kind of grays the lines a little bit of what my role is and then what a dietitian's role is as well.
Yeah.
I think what you said is fantastic because I think it's good to know about each other's fields, right? It's good to
Right.
know exactly what, or not exactly, but have an understanding of what each other does. However, when you kind of muddle that area, it really does become dangerous because then that athlete may potentially go to you or for me for more questions, right?
Yeah.
And if you talk to them about lifting, they may be more likely to ask you about certain questions. So
Yeah.
I think it can just get a little tricky in my opinion.
Yeah. It definitely can, but can also be helpful at the same time because they at least have both trusting people that they can go to for that. And like for me and my strength coaches, like it helps just kind of have that like common ground with the athletes too, that they know they can trust what they're saying and what I'm saying as long as it lines up to be the same information.
Yeah. I've taken the approach just because obviously I'm engaged to a dietitian. I'm just
Yeah.
like, if I'm not talking about carbs, fats, and proteins, I'm not having the conversation at all.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's usually like if somebody's like, "Hey, coach, what should I eat for this practice?" They're holding like last time it was like hard boiled eggs. I was like, the Nutri-Grain bar might be a little bit better, but
Yeah.
that's about as far as I'll go.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you first of all for breaking that down. I think that's a really important distinction. And the last kind of small question I have is would you prefer to be called a nutritionist or a dietitian?
Dietitian 100%.
Okay,
That's a common thing with our field, but it's also like hard, like in the athletics world, because not everyone knows what a dietitian is. So it's just kind of like educating in that. But I worked 5 years for this credential, and so I'd prefer to be called a dietitian, and that's where we can kind of remove some of the confusion too, with what a dietitian is versus a nutritionist.
I think that piece is really important, and it always makes me think of this one. I posted a video one time, and it was specifically about dietetics. And so I said I had nutritionist written in the caption because in my mind I was like, that's what more people are going to know. And so I was like, this might really piss off Tess if I'm being honest. So
Yeah.
I asked her, and she's like, you really need to put dietitian. And I was like, all right, because I was worried about it not going viral. And then it did go viral, and I was like, all right, well, I'm really just an ass. So it made a difference. I think it's good again for strength coaches to kind of understand your process a little bit better and to see how you approach your conversations and counseling with your athletes. When somebody comes in for an initial counseling session with you, what's your process? What are your kind of first steps? And then what are your main goals of that first counseling session?
Yeah, it's really getting to know the athlete if I haven't met them already. So figuring out like what their major is, like what their kind of schedule is like. Usually I'm going to know what sport they're with, but I'll ask them kind of what, especially with track, just because of how many different athletes I have, like what events they're doing. Um, and then kind of going from there on like, okay, what did you feel like worked for you in high school as far as your nutrition goes? What do you want to improve on now? Especially if they're new freshmen coming in. Sometimes they have their own questions that they want to just get answered first, whether it's regarding just like supplements or just basic things, or they just need more like ideas. But that first session is really just assessing like where they're at with nutrition, what their current habits are. Are they eating multiple times a day? Or are they just eating once a day? Are they eating enough to support their sport and everything like that? And so usually it's like 30 minutes. Sometimes it's an hour if my athlete just loves to chat, because some of them just come in, they're not really sure what to say. So it's just kind of prying things out of them, but also just kind of meeting them where they're at too. Because some of them, even like as crazy as it sounds, they're not interested in nutrition. They're just like, okay, but so it's really figuring out like what their goals are for their sport, not nutrition goals specifically, just their goals for their college career, and kind of working in it with that way. It's like, okay, they want to get up in the weight room, or they want to run faster. I'm like, okay, how can nutrition help you get there? And so it's kind of like relating it to them in that way so they can understand like, okay, I might need to eat more than once a day to get there.
I really like that process, right? And it's something that I've noticed that really good practitioners do. It's something where it can directly relate it to them and show them, okay, this is how we actually get you to where you want to be. And so I like that process a lot. I'm actually going to steal that from you for our upcoming athletes.
Go for it.
You mentioned a couple times people eating infrequently.
Yes.
What are some of the kind of the biggest issues that you may see or kind of misconceptions that you kind of run into when first working with athletes?
A lot of them just don't understand that like their food is fuel for them. So especially for my track athletes, they're afraid of getting an upset stomach before practice because their practice is at 1:30 in the afternoon. It's a kind of an awkward time, but then they're practicing for 3 hours and without anything on their system, they think they can just catch up with all their food after it because that's when their appetite is highest. And so some of it's they're sleeping so late that they just don't have an appetite in the morning. So they're not eating anything before practice, or they might eat one Nutri-Grain bar before, and then they're wondering why they're almost passing out, especially in outdoor season, in the middle of practice or once they get to weights afterwards. And so It really just depends on the sport, but that's kind of the biggest thing is their sleep schedules, just not understanding how food can help them. And so that biggest piece is just educating them on like, okay, our food is going to be this energy source for you. So I work with my track athletes. I do team talks every single week with them at our little team meetings, like literally less than 5 minutes because their attention span is not going to be anything more than that. And so it's really just getting that knowledge in their head of like, okay, this is how carbs can help you, how protein can help you with your pre-workout, post-workout recovery process, everything like that, how it can help them in the weight room, on the track, with their hydration too. And so it's just getting them to understand if you want to get to where you want to be, we need to just incorporate things slowly. Like I always tell them, like, I don't expect perfection and I don't expect you to add all of this at once. This is ideally where we want you to be at some point, but we can start with, if you're not used to eating breakfast, let's add a granola bar in the morning before you go to class. Where can we fit this in your schedule? So I work more so with like meal timelines versus like meal plans.
Okay. And so you've worked with an athlete, let's say now for multiple years.
Mm-hmm.
There's somebody who's kind of progressed through your program. What does a session look like then when you're consulting with them? Maybe they've had a lot of success. Obviously it's not linear, but what do those kind of maintenance sessions look like for you?
It's really just kind of check-ins, like how are their energy levels? How did they feel during practice? Were they kind of tired throughout practice? Did they notice if they didn't eat enough, like how that felt compared to the day that they fueled a lot better? Usually they can kind of tell and kind of understand their bodies a lot more too. For some that are kind of starting to transition out, or maybe they got injured, they notice that their appetite just dropped completely because they're not having as much activity. And so helping them get in things that they can tolerate, getting things that are easy for them to eat or at least drink, just because sometimes it's easier for them to drink something than eat something when their appetite is so poor.
So
Yeah,
go ahead.
no, that was it.
All right. So, it almost sounds like it's similar to the strength coach situation, right? Where if I'm working with someone for multiple years, my kind of dream scenario is that I don't even have to be there,
Yeah,
right? We can obviously make small tweaks. If I'm there, we can consult with them, but ultimately they have the tools to be successful on their own.
yeah,
Yeah. And so, we've brought up strength coaches multiple times. Obviously, as myself, I can't resist talking about strength coaches.
yeah.
I think the relationship is very important between our two professions. I think that's where, when we have recruits in, I talk about the four most important things. The first is school. The second is whatever sport they're playing. The third, in my opinion, is nutrition, because ultimately, the worst lifts I ever had are when athletes are underfueled, or ultimately, if they're not gaining weight, if they're not meeting their body composition goals, it's always directly linked to nutrition. And then the fourth is weightlifting in my order of importance. Maybe that might just be me kissing up to my fiance a little bit too, but I think those things, I truly believe in that order of importance. How can strength coaches kind of best support dietitians working with their athletes, or even with the sport coaches? What's the best ways that strength coaches can be that support system for dietitians?
Strength coaches are really like that middleman for me. So they have a lot more time with the athletes. Like I'll get like a lot of more one-on-one time with the athletes typically, when they set up meetings with me, but they're really the ones that are with them almost every day, aside from their head coaches and assistant coaches, when they're in the weight room and stuff. And they can see firsthand if they're underfueled or are actually well fueled because they're progressing well in the weight room. They can also help me, like if something happened in the weight room or at practice, they tend to know about the injuries before I do, unless the athlete tells me about it. And so they can help me figure out who needs different supplements, or I need to meet with based off what happened in the weight room or practice, like if they were passing out or they've not been fueling themselves properly for game days. Like for softball travel, one of our pitchers struggled with hydrating enough, getting enough food in for the weekends. And so we had some meetings once they got back, because sometimes the strength coach was there and I wasn't traveling with them. So they got to see firsthand when we needed to set up meetings with the athletes to figure out, okay, what are you currently eating? What can we add to your daily intake to help you not have that happen again? And so they're really the best resource outside of athletic trainers for me to really see how the athlete is doing, if they're actually following what we talked about. if they're actually adding in the food or snacks throughout the day that we talked about in their meetings, just because they have that interaction with them more often, and they can see just based off their energy levels or performance how well that's going for them.
I think we all would love to believe our athletes 24/7 and trust 100% of what they say,
Oh,
and
yeah.
just because people kind of bend the truth a little bit doesn't mean they're not a good person. But it's so interesting to me the amount of times that I'll have a conversation with Tess, or Tess will have a conversation with me, and we'll hear something completely different from
Yep.
each athlete. And then, exactly like you said, we can act as middlemen to each other to see what are they truly getting done, right? It was funny because most of the time it's just that they'll tell me, that they ate before practice, or did these certain things. Then they'll tell Tess that was completely incorrect. But it finally came back where it helped me out for one time because she was doing a consult with somebody at home, and sit there. That person was like, "Well, my energy demands are low because I'm not doing my workouts at home." So it was the first time I kind of got some help from that situation too. So it was
Yeah.
very nice. Again, I want an honest answer about this, and I won't take it at all as you bashing strength coaches. I think I appreciate having a dietitian on here because I think we can get a point of view from somebody who isn't a strength coach, right? Because everything that we're going to think is biased. Are there any kind of common problems that you face when working with strength coaches?
Um, Fortunately, not with the strength coaches I work with in my sports. Some I think have had issues, um, sometimes with like body image issues, just like maybe mentioning um, like weight goals. Like for female sports, especially, we really don't try to focus on weight goals, just because that number can get in their head a lot. And so we typically will look at like body composition goals, as far as like their muscle and fat ratio, and see how the coaches can help with that. But that also tells us to like if they are following what we talked about, or if they are doing what they need to be doing in the weight room. And so that's really kind of the only issue that we've kind of come across, but it's kind of just depends on the school.
Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of not really focusing on that specific number? Because for me, right, I was a wrestler in high school.
Mm-hmm.
I had to be a certain weight. And
Yeah.
so, and especially as a male too, it was just really easy for me to just look at it as purely black and white.
Yeah.
And I had to be here so I could compete. I think coaches, again, strength coaches do kind of struggle with not understanding why you can't really specifically use a weight number or weight goal versus body composition improvement and how you feel in your sport. Can you kind of just dive into that a little bit more?
Yeah. So, I mean, our weight's going to fluctuate, especially for females within 5 pounds just in a day, even just from eating and drinking um, all day long. It depends on like when you're weighing yourself throughout the day. That weight also never tells the whole picture. Your weight could go up, but that could just be water weight. And for some of my athletes that maybe have like a low body fat percentage, they go up in weight and they're thinking like, oh, this is great. We're on the right track. But then they drop like 5 pounds the next day. And it was just because they maybe ate a big meal the night before, retaining onto that extra sodium and water in their body. But it's not actually going up in their body composition test. And so we try to do those tests um, like throughout the semester versus like the in season, off season, because sometimes it is just going to be how their body reacts from their sport, from the intensity of their workouts, but are they feeling enough too? And so by doing those as frequently as we can, like every 8 weeks or so, we can kind of see how their body responds. That's when I can kind of check in with them. Okay, are you eating enough? Are you drinking enough? Like, has anything changed since this last test? And so we saw that with our softball girls this season. They actually dropped a lot more throughout season than they had before. And so it was very like a little bit concerning because I was like, okay, like what's happening? And they just like weren't eating enough while they were traveling, which they're traveling every other weekend. And that's like 3-4 days out of the week that they're not eating enough, which is difficult. So it kind of just depends on that.
I know this may be more case by case, but would you be more of an advocate for blind weigh-ins?
Yes, especially for females. And like I don't really do body composition tests with my track athletes just because they're a higher risk for eating disorders, um, things like that. So I only do those on a case by case basis, and then I keep track of like the women's basketball and softball. and we'll usually do a blind. But it's also like they'll usually want to know, and so I can explain those numbers to them. But we don't look at the BMI. We don't really look at the weight. We kind of look at that muscle to fat, like see what is like kind of a healthy spot for them, and it's not going to be ever usually the ideal weight based off their height.
And so, just for the coach's knowledge, is what are the sports that are a little bit more of a high risk for eating disorders?
Any female sport, but there's also a lot more hidden, like the weight focused sports with male athletes, eating disorders that are undiagnosed, just depending on their tendencies and like their hyperfixation on that number too. But track is really a big one, just because, and like cross country, just because they have such a lean body mass typically, and they and volleyball as well. And it depends on the head coaches too, and like their kind of influence on the athletes as well. If they have any comments to say about food or like their own maybe nutrition habits that they're trying to kind of push on their athletes.
And so, let's say a situation like that does occur, where a coach does kind of have negative language in relation to an athlete's body image or body weight, anything that may be kind of a risk factor for an eating disorder. How would you approach that situation?
Usually it's talking to the athlete first, like seeing how they feel with that, seeing how they actually feel like during practice, during games. If they're like, I feel great, I haven't felt any better than this, I'm like, great. Don't, 1 year in season, we don't need to focus on losing weight right now. And for like girls, especially, like if they have, like we're naturally going to have more body fat and we need to keep our hormones healthy, keep our cycles regular and things like that. And so educating them in that way, and just kind of encouraging them. Like, I know coach said this, but that doesn't have to apply to you right now. Like, try not to take it to heart. Like they usually have like good intentions and they think it's just based off performance, but it's like, okay, how can we use the strength coaches to get to that performance? If it's like a faster sprint time or higher jump, things like that, like encouraging even the head coach to like, okay, let's work with strength coach to see where we can kind of meet in the middle. And it's not going to be focused on weight. And so sometimes it's talking to the head coach too, just to be like, hey, like kind of have this conversation. It can be kind of concerning for the athletes to hear that. So if we can not do that, and we actually have like a coaches meeting, and like my boss talks to all the head coaches on like language they can use to help kind of minimize the eating disorder risk as well. So it's not only educating our athletes, but educating coaches too.
Well, I'm sure that preventative piece, I mean, is really beneficial because it's interesting to me, especially on the topic of body weight, right? Because it never has phased me.
Yeah.
I've certainly gone through points where I have, maybe not loved my body at that time, right? But it's never been to me like hanging on this specific number. And it was interesting because I weigh in every morning. It doesn't really affect how I kind of view myself, and
Yeah.
I can apply the logic to that situation, right? So I can know my total calories for yesterday were at a deficit, but I'm up 2 pounds because I had an entire Chipotle bowl at 9 p.m. and 3 bottles of water right before I went to bed, right?
Yeah.
But that's years of experience and years of understanding kind of the basics of it versus somebody who's an athlete who's 18 years old who does not have that background and can't really rationally think through those processes. And so that's where I can see sport coaches a lot of times kind of overstepping. They can feel like the athletes have those tools, or the coaches themselves can handle those situations, but that's not the same for every single person.
Yeah.
No. Well, I do have one final question for you, and this is just because I see Tess deal with it all the time. How many times a day do people mention the fact that you're a dietitian when they're eating something bad around you?
More often than I would like. And I always tell them, like, I'm never judging you for what you eat. I'm not the food police. I like anytime I get that, even just outside of athletics, I'm like, I'm human too. Like, there's some days I don't get vegetables. There's some days I don't get a single piece of fruit, and it's okay. It's all about finding that balance. That's what I work with my athletes with, is what's going to work for you that's going to be sustainable long term. If they love Chick-fil-A all the time, I'm like, okay, where can we add a fruit throughout your week? So I always see like what I can add to their diet. And I am very upfront with them. I'm like, I sometimes just eat ice cream just because I'm craving it, and that's okay. Or I eat a box of mac and cheese at 9 o'clock because I'm hungry and that's all I have in my pantry. And so it's just getting real with them on like, uh, there's no good or bad food. We can't place a moral value on food either. So it's just helping them take that shame out of it. Like there's never a bad food. There's food that we want to fuel our bodies with more often than some, but there's no good or bad food.
I think it bothers me more than it bothers Tess at this point because I just didn't like really see it. And then the amount of times that somebody would be like, "Oh, I'm eating a cookie in front of the dietitian," I'm like, dude, she does not care. Like
Yeah.
if you saw what I ate at home, and then the fact that she never once judges me for that, like you would be shocked.
Yeah.
Like I'll crush a whole little Caesar's pizza in front of her, and she's exactly what you said. Everything in moderation.
Yes.
And there has to be those times where you enjoy food because it's a really enjoyable experience.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my
Yeah.
friends said this before. It's like we have food that's like good for our soul and food that's like good, like just for like our bodies in general. And I thought that was so true because like there are times that like I definitely feel better when I'm eating more balanced meals throughout the day, but there's sometimes I just need that bowl of ice cream to like just help with whatever happened throughout the day, and then you just move on. Like you don't have to sit with it, you don't have to feel guilty about it. Like um and like I've gone through my own journey with that process because everyone starts somewhere with their nutrition, their health journey, whatever it is, and it's just finding what works for you too.
I went through that process last week. We were just talking about it. I was down in Texas for a conference, and I'm supposed to be in a calorie deficit right now to meet my goals. And then we went over to Lubbock, and I was like, I really could not care less because they've got Torchy's tacos, and I'm not going to
Yep,
have the opportunity to get these again. And
exactly.
I love Torchy's. I destroy Torchy's at any opportunity. So,
Yeah,
and again, it made me happy. I don't feel miserable now that I ate them. So it was definitely
yeah,
food for the soul.
yeah,
Well, Miranda, thank you so much for coming on. If anybody does have any questions for you, or if they kind of want to reach out and hear a little bit more from you, what would be a good way to follow you on social media, or is there an email where they can reach you?
yeah. They can follow me on social media on Instagram. That handle is just Miranda underscore Lee LEA 98. Or they can email me at my school email. That's perfectly fine as well if they prefer email.
Excellent.
So yeah,
Well, thank you. We really appreciate you coming on.
yeah, I appreciate it.
Absolutely.